My name is Isla. I'm 31, and I've never known how to disappear in a room, even when I wanted to. I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona, the kind of town where people notice difference before they notice detail. I was the girl with freckles, like a storm map, inked shoulders that made teachers frown, and a voice a little too loud to ignore. I used to think those things made me interesting. Then I learned they made me inconvenient, especially to women like Rachel. Rachel and I met in film school. She was polished where I was raw, symmetrical where I was spontaneous. We clicked in the way two ambitious women do when they're both afraid of being alone at the top or left, behind at the bottom. We weren't best friends. We were orbiting, collaborators, sometimes rivals. She had the look, the perfect teeth, the perfect chin, the Instagram feed that landed her brand partnerships before graduation. I had stories, quiet ones, messy ones you had to sit with before you understood why they mattered. She called me 3 years after we graduated and said, "I want you to be part of my wedding." Not a bridesmaid, not a speech, just part of it. She said she loved my eye, that I saw things most people missed, that she needed someone around who wouldn't be fake. That was Rachel, always wrapping exclusion in compliments. I said yes, because even if we weren't close anymore, there was something about being asked that I still craved. I had always been the extra one, the too much one, too bold, too pierced, too inked. I said yes because I thought maybe she was seeing past all that. 3 days before the wedding, I met her at the rehearsal space, a renovated barn with overpriced candles and white roses that looked too perfect to be real. She was holding a clipboard and talking to a florist about angles. When she turned to me, she smiled the way people smile when they're about to deliver a blow they think you'll thank them for. She said I looked beautiful. Then she said, "But you know, you kind of stand out a lot. Your tattoos are strong, and your hair is a whole vibe." She said it with a laugh, like a joke. But she wasn't joking. She touched my arm lightly, her manicured fingers grazing the ink I'd had done after my mother died, roses and script in her handwriting. She said something about aesthetic consistency, something about how the guests would be in soft tones, how the photographers were going for timeless. I nodded. I don't know why. I felt heat rush to my chest, not anger, embarrassment. Like I had shown up to a test without realizing there was a dress code. She said, "You'll still be there, of course, just maybe not right in the front. Maybe you could help out by the bar, keep things flowing." She said it as if it were a favor, as if she were letting me off the hook. I nodded again. What I didn't say was that I had taken time off work, that I had turned down a gig assisting on a short film because I wanted to be there, that I had spent 2 weeks shopping for a dress that made me feel both strong and soft, something that made peace with my contradictions. What I didn't say was that I had looked forward to being seen, not for applause, but for proof that I existed in someone else's story. I stood there in that whitewashed barn while she went back to directing centerpieces, and I felt something cold settle into my stomach. Not hatred, not even disappointment, just clarity. I wasn't meant to be part of the picture. I was a shadow that would ruin the shot, a body with edges, a face with history, a presence too loud for a pastel background. That night, I went back to the Airbnb I'd rented alone and sat at the small kitchen table staring at the dress I wouldn't wear. I thought about every time someone had told me I was brave for how I looked. Every time they said it like it was a burden I had chosen. Like existing in this skin, this frame, this version of femininity was an act of rebellion instead of simply survival. I didn't cry. I opened my laptop and I started writing, not about her, not yet, but about the moment a woman realizes she is the wrong shape for someone else's celebration, and how silence sometimes is not humility. It's the beginning of a scream. The day of the wedding was sharp with heat and expectation. Everything looked curated, down to the way the sunlight hit the rented stone walls of the venue and the glassware laid out like jewelry across white linen tables. I arrived early, as requested. No one greeted me. A woman with a headset and clipboard waved me toward the side of the barn near the outdoor bar, She looked harried and slightly annoyed, the way people always look when they've already decided you're not part of the plan, just an extension of the furniture. The bar was a reclaimed wooden counter, artfully distressed, stacked with champagne, flutes, and signature cocktail menus printed in calligraphy. I stood there in a dress I had ultimately chosen for its neutrality. Black, simple, long enough to hide the ink, but not myself. I thought maybe, just maybe, that decision would earn me a place again. I didn't expect the spotlight. I just wanted to belong in the frame. They told me to keep an eye on the drinks, to help if guests seemed confused, to make sure the trays don't sit empty. There were caterers, there were servers, but I was told I'd be the friendly face, the helping hand. And for a few minutes, I tried to believe it. I smiled. I arranged napkins. I poured half a glass of champagne when someone asked politely. But the real moment came when I heard her voice. Not calling to me, not thanking me, not introducing me, but directing the photographer. "Let's angle this way," she said. Too much of the bar in the background. I saw the camera shift. I saw her turn her shoulder slightly, subtly reposition the groom, smile with practiced ease. The shutter clicked. I was still in frame. She looked past me like I wasn't there. That's when it hit me. I wasn't here to help. I was here to disappear. I looked around the courtyard. The bridesmaids were clustered in perfect symmetry, soft pastel gowns flowing like water around their polished limbs. The guests were gathered under umbrellas, fanning themselves gently, laughing softly. And I was back here, behind the drinks, beside the ice buckets and the sweating glasses, part of the scenery but not the story. An accessory to be moved around when needed and ignored when not. It wasn't rage I felt. It was something much colder. A kind of internal collapse, like a building you'd convinced yourself was sturdy, only to realize the foundation was hollow. Kept smiling. I handed out glasses. I said congratulations to people who didn't know my name. I watched as Rachel floated through her day like it had been rehearsed 100 times. Maybe it had. And in every version, I was never meant to stand beside her. I was meant to stand behind her. At some point, a woman I didn't know complimented my hair, said it was wild in a fun way. Another said my freckles made me look like a real artist. I smiled and nodded and felt every word like a pin pushed deeper into something soft. I wasn't being seen. I was being styled, categorized, flattened into a texture. The kind that gives contrast to the bride without threatening to overshadow her. When the ceremony started, no one told me to join. I stood behind the bar and watched from a distance. I saw her glide down the aisle, veil floating, lips trembling in what looked like emotion. I wondered if she cried for joy or for performance. Maybe both. Some people cry when they get what they've always wanted. Others cry when they realize they've won a prize they don't know how to hold. And I stood there, the helper, the shadow, the conveniently placed distraction far enough from the lens to be edited out later. There was a moment, brief and brutal, when she turned during the vows and her eyes met mine. Not for long, not with recognition, just calculation, to check. That I was still where she had placed me, and I was. I didn't move. Not then, not yet. I watched her pose in white like the center of a painting, each frame curated with precision, each smile calculated to project the perfect balance of elegance and fragility. Her veil caught the light just enough to look ethereal, her hands arranged delicately on his chest like a woman who had never clenched a fist in her life. She stood there, surrounded by softness, soft flowers, soft voices, soft approval. It was the kind of moment meant to be remembered, the kind immortalized in silver frames and anniversary slideshows. And I stood 20 feet away, clutching an empty tray and feeling like the staff that hadn't been issued a uniform. I wasn't a guest, I wasn't a friend. I was a body tasked with blending in, staying useful, staying silent. They say weddings reveal people, that in the choreography of vows and speeches and centerpieces, the truth slips out through the cracks. I had believed her when she said she valued honesty, when she said I saw what others missed. What she meant was that I saw too much, that I didn't fit the backdrop. That my body, with its ink and freckles and history, made her uncomfortable in a story she wanted to tell in pastel and perfection. I watched her lean back into his arms for a dip shot. The photographer crouched and snapped it like a catch. Laughter erupted around them. She glowed. I used to think glow came from love. Now I knew it could just as easily come from being the only one allowed to shine. My dress stuck to my back with sweat, the kind that made silk cling in ways it shouldn't. I hadn't eaten. There was no place for me at the tables. I wasn't assigned a seat. No one had said it, but the omission said enough. I was there to fill in where needed, float, vanish, reappear only when a tray was empty or a guest looked momentarily lost. I wiped a ring of condensation from the wood of the bar and placed another flute beside a pyramid of untouched cocktails, wondering how many of the people here thought I was hired help. One man asked if I could bring him another whiskey. Another handed me his empty glass with a nod of thanks and didn't seem to notice when I didn't return. Maybe that was the most honest part of the night, how easily people accepted my place at the edge of their celebration. Rachel kept posing. She lifted her chin slightly, parted her lips just enough, turned her face toward the light like she'd practiced it. Maybe she had. Maybe all of this was her dream. And maybe I had no right to stand here and feel like I was being erased. But I did feel it. In every click of the shutter, in every sideways glance, in every space I didn't belong. Someone asked for a bottle opener. I handed it over. Someone else needed more napkins. I found them. I moved like a ghost who still had hands, still had weight, still had a name that no one wanted to say out loud. And all the while, I watched her collect her memories, carefully filtered, carefully composed, carefully devoid of anything that might complicate her narrative. I stood under the canopy of fairy lights as they cut the cake. I watched her lick frosting from her finger and laugh as if the world had never demanded an apology from her. And I knew then with a certainty that startled me that I wasn't sad because I had been left out. I was angry because I had helped build her. I had read drafts of her grad school applications. I had stayed up nights helping her cut film reels. I had talked her through her first panic attack when her internship fell apart. I had reminded her that she was talented when she thought she was mediocre. I had sat in the second row at 3 of her screenings, clapping like a parent. And now I was standing behind a bar like a stand-in, like a waitress who hadn't learned to keep her mouth shut, like a body she could crop. She wanted a clean canvas, and I was ink. The photos would show her surrounded by light, but I knew what was standing just out of frame. Me. Later, when the photos went up, carefully edited, posted in clusters, captioned with poems and hashtags, I searched for myself. Not because I needed the attention, not because I wanted to be tagged. I just wanted proof that I had been there, that I hadn't imagined the heat, the weight of the glasses in my hands, the ache in my calves from standing in shoes too formal for what I was asked to do. But I wasn't there. Not in the carousel of portraits taken against the sun-drenched wall. Not in the shots of laughter caught mid-bloom. Not in the table toasts, the bouquet toss, the perfectly timed kiss under the string lights. I scrolled slowly, pausing at every group photo, every guest captured mid-cheer. People I hadn't even spoken to were there, framed in golden hour light, looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine. People I'd helped serve, people I'd cleaned up after, people who had looked past me like I was part of the setup. They were immortalized. I was not. And then I found it. One photo, buried in a set taken near the bar. Rachel in the foreground, smiling, hand extended mid-laugh. Behind her, blurred just enough to be anonymous, a woman holding a tray of champagne flutes, cropped so that only the edge of my shoulder and the top of my curls were visible. It could have been anyone. It was me. I zoomed in, and for a moment, I felt something collapse inside my chest. Not because I had been erased, but because I had been almost visible, almost counted, almost part of the memory. The precision of it stung more than if I had been forgotten altogether. This wasn't forgetting. This was removal. Intentional, quiet, clean. I remembered the moment she threw the bouquet. It had arced high, unexpected, bounced once off a bridesmaid's hand and spiraled into the air like a drunk bird. It was heading for the gravel. Without thinking, I caught it. Mid-air. Clean. One-handed. People clapped, laughed, someone whistled. Rachel turned, blinked, smiled. She said something I couldn't hear, and then she walked away. There were no photos of that either. And I remembered later, during the dance set, someone spilled a drink and a tray of glasses started to fall. I reached out and caught two mid-tip, stopping a full crash. No one noticed. One of the caterers gave me a thumbs up. I nodded and placed the glasses back. There were no photos of that either. I thought of the moments I had made things smoother, easier. Thought of the way I had smiled when I passed drinks, the way I had laughed when someone made an awkward joke. The way I had kept people out of the photographer's path anticipating the angles before they asked. I wasn't just invisible, I had been useful. And still, I was nowhere. I looked at the comment section. Friends praising the aesthetic. The dress. The color scheme. Strangers calling it goals. Ethereal. So well composed. I read them all. Every compliment felt like a nail closing a coffin. Because I had been there. I had witnessed all of it. I had helped hold it. Together. And in the story she told the world, I did not exist. The wedding photos weren't memory. They were myth-making. And in her myth, I was the blur. It wasn't that she hated me. It was worse. She had edited me out for symmetry, for control, for brand. Consistency. I didn't fit the color palette. My body didn't reflect the soft femininity she was marketing. My tattoos were too bold. My expression too grounded. I couldn't be airbrushed into background harmony, so I was removed. And as I sat there scrolling through her curated joy, I realized something. I had become what I used to fear. The woman at the edge of the frame. The woman with the camera. In her hand, not pointed outward, but inward. Recording a truth no one had asked for, but a truth that demanded to be told. Not in likes, not in filtered smiles, but in film. That night, while the world of curated love slept and her wedding hashtag bloomed across social media, I opened my laptop and started to write. Not out of ambition, but survival. The glow of the screen was the only light in the room. I hadn't even changed out of my dress. The hem still smelled faintly of wine and lilac and sweat. I sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet Airbnb and let the cursor blink on the blank document like a metronome for my breath. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew that if I didn't say something, I might vanish completely. The first line came out sharp. Then another. And another. They weren't beautiful. They weren't crafted. They were blunt instruments. I wasn't writing a script. I was writing myself back into the world. I was writing to prove that I had been there. That I had hands. That I had a voice. That I had caught the bouquet and held the tray and laughed with strangers and stood quietly while someone else's life was made big enough to eclipse mine. I wrote for hours. I didn't stop to edit. I didn't pause to doubt. I poured every observation, every fragment, every contradiction I had swallowed that day onto the page. I wrote about the way beauty can be exclusion, about how erasure doesn't always come with cruelty. Sometimes it comes with smiles and champagne and polite reassignments. I wrote about the bar, the bouquet, the photograph that almost captured me but didn't. I wrote about Rachel's hand brushing my shoulder with practiced delicacy, the same hand that once trembled when she held a camera in film school. I wrote about symmetry, about silence, about what it feels like to be dressed for a celebration and end up serving it. I didn't name her, not once. This wasn't revenge, this wasn't rage, this was restoration. I was stitching myself back together in paragraphs and pacing and raw, unfiltered truth. I wrote until the sky outside turned that deep, faint blue that only happens before dawn. I saved the file and didn't reread it. I closed the laptop and cried, not because I was broken, but because I had finally put something down that I wasn't going to pick back up again. Over the next week, I opened the document every night. I kept adding, layer by layer, scene by scene. It started forming a structure, a character, a voice. She wasn't me, not exactly, but she wore my shoes. She poured the drinks. She stood behind the lens. She watched the bride float by like a ghost in a dress made of glass. The story wasn't about her pain. It was about the silence after, about the space between presence and disappearance. I called it the edge of the frame. I didn't know if it was a short story, a monologue, a script. I didn't care. It was mine. And it was growing. During the day, I went back to my freelance jobs, editing reels, scripting client videos, doing voiceover temp tracks for people who didn't want to pay for actors. But every night, I came back to the document like a ritual. Like medicine. Like a whispered affirmation that I hadn't gone invisible. Not really. That even if the world had tried to crop me out, I could still find the focus. I started watching short films again. The kind that lived in the shadows of festivals. Stories about dishwashers and nurses and tired daughters. I studied them like they were gospel. I picked apart how they held silence, how they built rage without shouting, how they placed women at the center without apology. I started making notes, storyboards, drafts, and one night, 3 weeks after the wedding, I opened a new file. Fade in, I wrote it all down, every beat, every breath. I wrote the bar, the bouquet, the look, the moment of erasure that no one else had seen because they hadn't been looking for me. I wrote it for all the girls who handed out champagne and dresses they bought to be noticed. I wrote it for the women who edited themselves out of someone else's spotlight for the sake of harmony. I wrote it for the ones who were always just out of frame. I didn't know where it would go, but I knew it had begun. The film started with a tray of empty glasses. No faces, no music, just hands moving, collecting, cleaning. I didn't write her name. I didn't recreate the wedding. I wasn't interested in revenge or dramatizing a dress. What I wanted was silence, the kind that hums beneath surface joy, the kind that women carry like another layer of skin, the kind that creeps in when you're standing on the edge of someone else's spotlight, smiling just enough to not be noticed. Cast an actress with freckled skin and ink on her arms. I told her not to perform. I told her to move like she was real. Like she had been told again and again that her presence was a little too much, a little too loud, a little too different. The set was simple, a wedding space, generic and clean. White flowers, soft linens, a rented bar with vintage lights that flickered slightly out of rhythm. We shot it over 2 weekends. I borrowed equipment, called in favors. No one was paid. Much. Everyone showed up anyway. We shot from behind her, from the corners, from under tables and through windows. I wanted the viewer to feel what it's like to be present and unseen. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her hands told the story, passing glasses, adjusting chairs, wiping lipstick off a rim before anyone saw. She watched the celebration with eyes that didn't envy or hate, only understood. And in the background, the bride and groom were never fully shown. Just glimpses, just laughter, just carefully composed joy. There's a moment in the film when the character stands in the kitchen, alone. The light's too bright and too cold, and stares at a bouquet lying in a trash can. She doesn't pick it up. She doesn't cry. She just stares. That moment took one take. Everyone on set went quiet after. We knew we had found it. That moment where recognition meets resignation. I edited it in my apartment over coffee and silence, and 2-hour windows between freelance deadlines. I didn't score it until the very end. I used only breath and ambient sound and the soft clinking of glass. The title card came last. Edgework. A term used in psychology and mountaineering. And in art, the dangerous line between control and chaos. When I submitted it to a small local festival, I didn't expect anything. I just wanted to see it projected once, just once on a wall where someone else might sit in the dark and feel seen. But it traveled. From that small theater in Brooklyn to a women's short film night in Toronto, then across borders and inboxes. I'd never touched. It found its way into hands I didn't know were open. I started getting messages, emails. A girl from Sweden wrote, "I didn't know anyone else felt like this." A director from Paris said, "It says so much without saying anything." A woman from Mexico City said, "I cried for the first time in 2 years." And still, I never mentioned her, because the story wasn't about her. It was about the girl who helped build the stage and never got to stand on it. It was about the moment you realize you were never invited to be real, only useful, only silent, only symmetrical. I didn't film rage. I filmed stillness. Grief without tears. Visibility without permission. And people saw it. Really saw it. Because it wasn't just mine. It was a mirror for every woman who'd been airbrushed out of memory because she didn't fit the color scheme. When I watched the final cut in a screening room for the first time with strangers in the seats beside me, I almost couldn't breathe. The silence in the room was sacred. No one coughed, no one moved. When the lights came up, no one clapped right away. They sat in it. That was all I wanted. Not applause. Just pause. I walked home that night alone under streetlights, wrapped in my coat, my phone heavy with messages. And I smiled. Not because I had said something loud, but because I had said something quiet that finally reached the people it needed to. The film didn't name me either, but it made me real, and that was the point. The email came on a Wednesday afternoon, tucked between a spam message and a receipt for almond milk. It was short, formal, almost anticlimactic. A line about selection, a PDF attachment, a signature from someone whose name I didn't recognize. I clicked on the file without fully reading the text, heart already racing as if my body understood before my mind caught up. And there it was, the logo, the laurels, the name of the festival, Cannes, and then mine, in bold, Isla Reed, writer, director, official selection. For a moment, I didn't move. I just stared. Not with joy, not with disbelief, but with the eerie stillness of someone watching their shadow detach and walk ahead of them. I'd always imagined news like that would come with screaming or champagne or phone calls, but what I felt was quieter, like an ache releasing, like a pressure point loosening after years of pretending it didn't hurt. I read the email again. Then I laughed, alone, in the middle of my apartment, with half a coffee left cold on the table and a to-do list I wouldn't finish. I put my hands on my face and let the heat rise. Not tears, not yet, just heat. And then I opened a blank document and typed my name, Isla Reed. I watched the letters appear and thought, this is mine. Finally. Fully. Publicly. The weeks that followed moved like a montage. Plane tickets, dress fittings, phone calls from people I hadn't heard from in years. My inbox grew teeth. Requests for interviews, podcast invitations, congratulations laced with subtle envy. People were suddenly kind in a new way, carefully admiring, journalistic. As if success made me safer to touch. As if recognition had smoothed the edges that once made me inconvenient. I read headlines that said, bold debut from new female voice, and emotional triumph of the invisibilized. I saw stills from the film beside my face in blogs and newsletters. I heard my name spoken out loud by strangers in accents I didn't know. It was strange, not because it wasn't deserved, but because it had taken so long for the world to notice. What had always been there? The story, the hands, the breath behind the silence. I didn't think about Rachel. Not immediately, not when the flight took off, not when the badge went around my neck, but when I stepped onto the croisette, when the cameras started flashing, not for me, not yet, but for everyone around me. I felt something shift. I remembered standing behind the bar, clutching a tray, watching her pose in white while the lens devoured her. And now, here I was, on the other side of the lens, lit, named, unhidden. The festival was noise and nerves and late-night panels and espresso at odd hours. It was glamorous and exhausting and too fast to process. But my screening was quiet, just as I wanted it. A dark room, a hush before the first frame, the sound of breath shifting as the story unfolded. And then, when the lights rose, applause. Not thunderous, not explosive, but real, lingering. A woman in the second row placed her hand over her heart. I nodded at her. She understood. After the Q&A, a journalist asked if the film was about someone specific. I said no. I said it was about a condition, not a person. About being erased gently, with kindness, with politeness, with aesthetic reasoning. About how women learn to apologize for being in the shot. About the shape of absence. They quoted that. The shape of absence. It ended up in 3 articles. Back at the hotel that night, I opened my phone and scrolled through social media. Someone had posted a photo of me at the premiere, candid, laughing. The caption read, "The woman who made the loudest film without raising her voice." I saved it, not for ego, but for proof that I was no longer behind anyone. My name wasn't on the edge of the frame anymore, it was the frame. I walked the carpet alone. Not out of defiance, not out of drama, but because I could. The fabric of my dress swept against the red with a sound no one else noticed, but to me it was thunder. I didn't hold anyone's hand. No designer clung to my side. No publicist whispered which angle to turn. I didn't perform grace. I just moved forward, one step at a time, in heels I had chosen for comfort, not spectacle. The flashbulbs went off in bursts around me, chaotic and hungry, but none of it touched me in the way it used to. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to be invited in. I was already here. There were voices calling names, none of them mine. But I didn't shrink. I didn't look down. I didn't make myself smaller to make space for someone else's shine. I walked like the light belonged to me too, because it did. Not because someone gave it to me, but because I stopped asking for permission to carry it. The walkway was long, the cameras unrelenting. My name wasn't the loudest that night, but it was printed. On the screen, on the pass around my neck, on the schedule hung in glass display cases. And more than that, it was held in the mouths of people who had watched the film and remembered it. That was enough. As I stepped inside the theater, I felt the fabric of who I used to be slide off like a second skin. The girl at the bar. The blur in the photograph. The woman who caught the bouquet and apologized for catching it. I carried her with me still, but not as baggage. As witness. As evidence. I had worn invisibility for so long it had begun to feel like armor. But on that night, under the lights, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I wasn't in danger. I wasn't being erased. I was being seen, fully, without compromise. During the screening, I didn't watch the film. I watched the audience. Watched their posture shift, their breathing slow. Watched their expressions soften, then tighten. I watched them lean into the stillness, into the unspoken, into the unnamed ache I had once mistaken for solitude. And I understood then that I had made something honest enough to find its way into other people's quiet. And that meant more than applause. After the screening, a woman approached me in the hallway. She didn't say much, just touched my hand briefly and whispered, "Thank you for making me visible." I nodded. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Her words were not about validation. They were about arrival. For both of us. Back at the hotel, I stood on the balcony and looked out at the ocean. The waves didn't care who I was. They didn't clap. They didn't name drop. They just kept arriving, again and again, like breath. I stood there, barefoot, dress loose around my ankles, and thought about all the rooms I had once tried to enter with my voice lowered and my shoulders rounded. All the places I had made myself palatable to be allowed in. And all the pieces of myself I had left behind in those rooms just to be tolerated. But I had built something new. Not loud, not large, but undeniable. I never saw Rachel again. Not in person. But one night, months later, I saw her post a photo from someone else's wedding. She stood in the middle, arm around a new bride, her smile identical to the one from her own ceremony. Filtered. Perfect. I didn't feel anything sharp, just distance. We had always been moving in different directions. I just didn't realize how far until I stopped trying to follow her light and lit my own instead. I turned off my phone and opened my notebook. Not a laptop, a notebook. Pen on paper. I wrote a single line, "I don't need a frame to prove I exist." Then I closed it. I went to bed that night not as someone who had arrived, but someone who no longer needed to. The journey wasn't about being welcomed. It was about walking in anyway. I had stood in the shadow long enough to learn its shape, and now, finally, I was done being background.